He thought confessing his betrayal over our anniversary candles was the ultimate cruelty. He was wrong. The real danger isn't my anger, but my absolute silence. By morning, I won't cry or beg. I will piece together the elaborate fraud my husband thought he had hidden perfectly. One night with his dream woman was never just infidelity. It was the prologue to a long con, and he chose the absolute wrong woman to leave behind. My name is Aria Marshall. I am 41 years old. I serve as the Director of Risk Strategy at Meridian Civic Systems, a sprawling digital infrastructure firm that anchors the corporate skyline of Charlotte. My entire career is built on the architecture of disaster. At Meridian, my job is to look at a perfectly functioning network and imagine exactly how it will burn down. I find the hairline fractures in the code. I build firewalls against human error and greed. I am the woman the board calls when servers crash, when data breaches threaten to bleed millions in capital, when corporate structures teeter on the very edge of the abyss. I process panic into actionable sequential steps. I do not feel the heat of the fire. I simply map the exits and cut off the oxygen to the flames. My husband is Dean Holloway. He is 44 years old. He is the charismatic founder of Hollow House Atelier, a boutique high-end branding studio that caters to the city's elite. He crafts narratives for developers and socialites who want to buy prestige. For 12 years, we have been the prototype of the modern, upwardly mobile power couple. We are cultivated, polite, and relentlessly admired by our social circle. We possess the kind of frictionless, beautifully curated marriage that other people put on their vision boards. Tonight was our 12th anniversary. Dean had specifically requested something highly private this year. There would be no crowded reservations at the new Michelin-starred spot downtown, no overlapping voices from other tables, no flashing cameras. Just us, he had said, smiling that effortless smile of his. So, I built a sanctuary in our own dining room. I had spent 4 hours preparing the meal. I drove to a specialty butcher 2 towns over to source the specific cut of beef for the braised short ribs he loved. I opened a heavy Bordeaux, aged for 10 years, allowing it to breathe perfectly on the mahogany sideboard. I arranged the crystal and silverware with geometric precision. I even found the old vinyl record we used to play on a continuous loop during our first year together. Back when we lived in a cramped walk-up apartment, the needle was tracing the groove, filling the quiet space with a nostalgic, crackling warmth. He was late when the heavy oak front door finally clicked open. The very air in the hallway seemed to shift and chill. I stepped out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on a crisp linen towel, and stopped dead in my tracks. Dean was not wearing his usual tailored but relaxed office attire. He was dressed for a luxury gala. He wore a sharp, bespoke charcoal suit, a silk pocket square folded perfectly. His hair swept back with meticulous care, and then the scent hit me. It was heavy, floral, laced with something metallic and sweet. A woman's luxury perfume, but far more unsettling than the scent was the look in his eyes. He surveyed the entryway console, the woven rug, and finally me, with the detached, polite curiosity of a wealthy tourist evaluating a hotel lobby. He did not belong here tonight. Spiritually, he had already checked out. I stood by the dining table, the bottle of Bordeaux in my hand, ready to pour the first glass. "You are late," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. Dean did not take off his jacket. He walked slowly to the edge of the dining table, looking down at the flickering taper candles, the pristine china, the steam rising softly from the plates. "Aria," he began, his tone horrifyingly measured. "I am not staying tonight." I kept my hand firmly wrapped around the cold glass neck of the bottle. I did not speak. I waited for the incoming data. "I have a date," he continued, slipping his hands casually into his tailored trouser pockets. With Celeste Wynne, the name meant absolutely nothing to me, just a random collection of syllables, but he spoke it with a terrifying, breathless reverence. "She is the woman of my dreams, Aria." I realized that keeping this a secret, ignoring it, is a massive disservice to us both. I have to be completely honest with myself. I need to pursue this. It was the absolute, sociopathic serenity in his voice that paralyzed the room. If he had shouted, if he had confessed in a tearful, guilty breakdown, it would have been a recognizable human failing. But this was something else entirely. He was speaking as if he were in a board meeting. He was delivering a quarterly update on the structural integrity of our marriage, proposing a pivot in strategy. I watched his mouth move, registering the absurd, handsome geometry of his jawline as he casually dismantled a 12-year life. "It is just for one night," he offered smoothly, leaning slightly forward as if closing a minor routine business deal. "I will be back tomorrow morning. We can sit down and talk about how to navigate this transition then. You have to understand, Arya, you are still the most stable part of my life. You are my anchor, but I need to explore this spark. It is the only way I can live authentically." Authentically. The buzzword hung heavy over the roasted vegetables and the dying flames of the candles. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew a small, thick card. He placed it carefully on the table, aligning it perfectly right next to his empty wine glass. I looked down. It was a piece of expensive hotel stationery, the Grand Bohemian. He had written the name down. In his warped, heavily branded mind, this gesture of total transparency somehow absolved him of the betrayal. He was not sneaking around in the shadows. He was declaring his infidelity with a neat professional paper trail. He genuinely believed this made his actions civilized. He saw himself as a gentleman of modern moral complexity, bravely stepping into his truth. "I am sorry if the timing hurts," he murmured, giving the meticulously set table one last, almost pitying glance. "But there is never a good time for the truth," without waiting for me to nod, to scream, or to shatter the heavy wine bottle against his pristine jaw. Dean turned on his heel. His expensive leather soles clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The heavy front door opened and shut with a definitive, hollow thud. The vibration rattled the crystal glasses on the table. The candles continued to burn. The record player reached the end of the track, the needle hissing rhythmically in the empty groove. A normal wife, a woman ruled by the sudden, violent influx of grief, would have collapsed. She would have swept the china off the table in a blinding, screaming rage. She would have called her sister, her mother, her best friend, sobbing hysterically into the receiver until her voice gave out. I did none of those things. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the turntable. I felt a strange detachment, a sudden untethering from my own flesh. The woman who was married to Dean Holloway was currently bleeding out on the dining room rug, her heart punctured by a perfectly tailored speech. But the director of risk strategy at Meridian Civic Systems was already stepping over the body, assessing the crime scene. I stood perfectly still for 3 full minutes. I let the silence map the exact perimeter of the damage. My husband had just stepped out of our anniversary dinner to sleep with his dream woman, leaving me a hotel name as a professional courtesy. The cold, mechanical part of my brain booted up, bypassing the paralyzed heart entirely. I walked over to the record player and lifted the needle. The hiss stopped. I returned to the table and blew out the candles. One by one, the smoke curled upward, smelling of charred cotton wicks and extinguished romance. I walked straight into my home office. From the bottom drawer of my desk, I retrieved a small, black leather notebook. It was the exact same type of notebook I used at Meridian when a critical systems failure occurred. The pages were designed for logging precise timelines, identifying compromised nodes, and drafting immediate containment protocols. I sat down at my desk, uncapped my favorite pen, and wrote down the date and the exact time. Then, I wrote down exactly what Dean had said, word for word, committing the data to the record. I have a date, with Celeste Wynne. She is the woman of my dreams. I have to be completely honest with myself. It is just one night. You are still the most stable part of my life. I stared at the black ink drying on the pale page. My instincts, sharpened by years of predicting catastrophic corporate failures, hummed a low, incredibly dangerous warning in my veins. A man does not deliver a speech that polished, that ruthlessly calm, and that structurally sound on a whim. This was not a sudden, unpredictable crime of passion. This was a calculated, premeditated structural demolition. And Dean Holloway had just made the fatal mistake of handing the risk manager the blueprints. The moment the front door closed, the grieving wife in me died, and the risk strategist took absolute control. I did not pour the wine. I did not collapse onto the pristine rug. Tears are a biological response to sudden loss, but I had not lost a husband tonight. I had uncovered a systemic vulnerability. I walked past the dining room table, ignoring the cooling braised short ribs, and went straight to the kitchen island. There, sitting perfectly centered on a charging mat, was our shared household tablet. It was meant for controlling the smart thermostat and ordering groceries. But digital hygiene is rarely absolute. People get lazy. Dean, with his aesthetic brilliance, was notoriously lazy with his digital footprint. I carried the tablet into my office, plugged it into my secure workstation, and initiated a hard backup of everything. I mirrored the family cloud drive, the shared calendars, and the synced photo streams. The progress bar crawled across my monitor. While it downloaded, I opened his web browser history. It was clean, too clean. The mark of a man actively managing a secret, but he had forgotten the application cache. I dug into the hidden folders and found the digital residue of an encrypted messaging application he had installed and deleted multiple times. The metadata alone painted a damning picture. Cross-referencing the timestamp of those installations with our shared calendar, a distinct pattern emerged. The random Thursday night networking events, the weekend brand retreats down in Charleston, they all perfectly aligned with the spikes in his hidden application activity. This had been going on for over 8 months. Celeste Wynne was not a sudden, overwhelming spark. She was a scheduled, long-term project. The date of our anniversary was not a coincidence. It was a strategically chosen launch date for his new narrative. My screen flashed. The cloud backup was complete. I opened the synced notes application. Dean used it to draft pitches for his branding studio, but there, buried under a folder labeled Personal Operations, was a document titled Transition Thoughts. I clicked it. It was a list of talking points. He had literally written a public relations script for our separation. I read the bullet points, my pulse steadying into a cold, rhythmic thud. Arya is married to her work. She treats our relationship like a spreadsheet. I have felt completely emotionally starved for the past 3 years. I finally had to choose my own mental survival. It was masterful. He was positioning himself not as a cheating husband, but as a victim of a sterile, corporate wife, bravely stepping out into the light to find warmth. I moved to the deleted items folder in his calendar. People always forget to empty the digital trash. There it was. Exactly 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday afternoon when he claimed to be scouting a location for a shoot, he had a 2-hour consultation booked with a prominent family law attorney in the city. He had secured his legal perimeter long before he dropped that hotel stationery on my dining table. He thought he was playing a game of chess with a woman who did not even know the board was set. But the infidelity and the spin were just social maneuvers. I needed to see the underlying architecture. I needed to see the money. I logged into our joint banking portal. We kept our main operating accounts together for mortgage payments and shared expenses. I downloaded the last 24 months of transaction history into a massive spreadsheet. Then, I wrote a quick macro to filter out our standard overhead utilities, property taxes, grocery deliveries, car leases. I wanted the anomalies. Within seconds, a pattern lit up the screen. Every month, for the past 9 months, exactly $4,500 had been transferred out of our joint savings and routed to a limited liability company called Blue Aster Ventures. I had never heard of it. It was not a vendor for his branding studio. It was a black hole. He had siphoned over $40,000 right under my nose, masking it in a blur of complex, high-volume transactions he knew I rarely scrutinized because I trusted him. Trust is the single biggest security flaw in any system. I dug deeper, searching the bank's document portal for any recent notices. In the archived correspondence, hidden beneath digital monthly statements, I found a portable document format file that made the air in my office turn to ice. It was an approval notice for a home equity line of credit. A massive loan, leveraged entirely against the paid-off equity of our primary residence. The amount was staggering, several hundreds of thousands of dollars. I scrolled rapidly to the final page of the document, the signature block. There was Dean's looping, artistic digital signature, and right next to it, confirming the encumbrance of the property we owned jointly, was my own electronic signature, a perfect, digitally verified stamp of approval. I had never seen this document. I had never signed it. The timestamp on the electronic signature was from a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I immediately cross-referenced it with my own work calendar. On that exact date, at that exact time, I had been in the air, flying cross-country to Denver for a corporate security summit, completely disconnected from wireless internet. It was physically impossible for me to have signed it. Dean had bypassed the security protocols. He had likely used this very tablet, logged into my saved email sessions, and authorized a massive financial liability in my name. This was no longer a failing marriage. This was a financial crime. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was 3 a.m. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved in my contacts 5 years ago, given to me by a senior vice president at work who had gone through a notoriously vicious corporate divorce. The line rang 3 times. A sharp, awake voice answered. "Tessa Baird." "Tessa, this is Aria Marshall. We have not met, but Robert Vance gave me your number. He said you are the person to call when a house is burning down and the arsonist is locking the doors." "Robert is dramatic, but accurate," Tessa replied, her voice instantly shifting into professional gear. "Tell me what is on fire." "My husband just left me for another woman tonight. But more importantly, I just found proof that he forged my signature to leverage a massive line of credit against our home, and he is draining joint assets into an undisclosed corporate entity. He thinks I am currently crying in our dining room. Are you—" "No, I am downloading the bank servers." I heard a soft chuckle on the other end of the line. "Good. Do not alert him. Do not text him. Pack a bag. Bring every physical financial document you have in the house, your passport, and your laptop. Be at my office at 8 o'clock sharp. I will be there." I hung up. The operational phase had begun. I moved through the dark house with absolute precision. I took 2 large travel bags from the hall closet. In one, I packed a week's worth of business attire, toiletries, and my passport. Into the other, the heavy-duty leather briefcase I used for board meetings. I packed the external hard drives containing the backups, the shared tablet, our physical tax returns from the filing cabinet, property deeds, and every single bank statement I had just printed. I walked back into the dining room. The table was exactly as he had left it. The expensive hotel stationery sat next to the empty wine glass. I picked up the small card with the name of the hotel on it and dropped it into the trash can. I did not write him a letter. I did not leave a tear-stained note demanding an explanation. I did not send a text message calling him a monster. I gave him absolutely nothing to work with. I gave him a void. Dean had calculated every single variable in his grand escape plan, but he had miscalculated his opponent. He expected a grieving wife he could easily manage and manipulate with polite transparency. Before the sun even breached the horizon, painting the city skyline in bruised shades of purple and gray, I locked the front door behind me. I walked to my car, put the bags in the trunk, and drove away. He wanted an elegant transition. Instead, he was going to walk into a vacuum. A perfectly silent house where the locks were about to change and the financial traps he had set were about to snap shut on his own wrists. The mahogany conference table in Tessa Baird's downtown office felt significantly more like a sterile operating theater than a standard legal workspace. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The city outside the towering, floor-to-ceiling windows was just waking up to the morning commute, entirely oblivious to the fact that I was actively dissecting a 12-year marriage. Tessa sat across from me, a sleek silver pen poised motionless over a stark yellow legal pad. Beside her sat Monroe Keats. Tessa had introduced him as her absolute apex predator, officially. His title was forensic accountant. Practically, he was a man who could look at a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and pinpoint the exact rat chewing on the copper wires. Monroe did not drink coffee. He did not engage in pleasantries or small talk. He simply consumed the external hard drives I had brought with the intense, unblinking focus of a diamond cutter. Within 45 minutes, he had mapped the exact architecture of the digital forgery. He projected the massive loan document onto the smartboard mounted on the wall. The document was a standard commercial form, 32 pages long, absolutely riddled with dense indemnification clauses and variable interest rate schedules. But the final page was the definitive kill shot. He zoomed in heavily on the electronic signature block bearing my name. Beside it, he pulled up the flight manifest and my internal corporate travel log from Meridian Civic Systems. "Look closely at the timestamp," Monroe said, his voice a dry, mechanical rasp. 4:14 in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. I stared at the black numbers glowing on the screen. I was on flight 712 to Denver. At that exact minute, we were 30,000 feet in the air over Ohio. The aircraft had absolutely no functioning satellite internet. My corporate devices were hard-locked into airplane mode per strict company security protocols. Tessa tapped her pen sharply against the polished wood. "He spoofed your device. He likely used your saved credentials on the home network to bypass the two-factor authentication guardrails. It is not just marital fraud, it is federal wire fraud. We have the absolute leverage." Monroe's fingers flew rapidly across his mechanical keyboard, the clicking echoing sharply in the quiet room. He was tracing the divergent streams of our income, following the money through a digital maze. "I need to completely isolate your uncontaminated capital," he muttered. He pulled up an old routing number from the archives. "The proceeds from the downtown loft you sold a year before the wedding, you parked it in a high-yield municipal bond fund and let it sit dormant. Did he ever deposit any external funds into this specific account?" "Never," I replied instantly. "It was completely autonomous." "Excellent," Tessa interjected, her tone dropping into a predatory register. "Because he never commingled those specific assets. We can ring-fence that money right now. We file an emergency motion for asset preservation before noon today. He will not be able to touch a single cent of your history." But the true masterpiece of Dean's deception was still buried deep in the raw data. Monroe had successfully bypassed a remarkably weak administrative password on a compressed file folder labeled with an innocuous project code. When it finally unzipped and populated the screen, the room went entirely silent. Blue Aster Ventures was not merely a holding company for stolen funds. It was a classic nested doll structure. Dean had spun off 3 separate limited liability sub-entities to handle land acquisition, construction vendors, and marketing operations. He was attempting to build a sprawling, ultra-luxury event space on the lucrative outskirts of the city. He had expensive architectural renderings, approved zoning permits, and most importantly, a massive, highly polished investor pitch deck. Monroe clicked methodically through the slides. Slide after slide of Dean's signature aspirational marketing jargon filled the screen. Then, he reached slide 12. My own face stared back at me from the glowing board. It was a professional corporate headshot taken for a major industry publication 2 years ago. Beneath my photograph, my name was printed in a crisp, elegant font, followed by a fabricated title, Lead Strategic Advisor. The bullet points below detailed my exact salary bracket, my executive position at Meridian, and my flawless track record in corporate risk mitigation. For 12 years, I truly believed I was his equal partner. Looking at the glossy presentation, I realized I was merely an asset on his balance sheet. Dean had not just stolen my money, he had aggressively commodified my professional reputation. He was using my corporate stability as a silent, heavily implied guarantor to comfort his nervous venture capitalists. He was actively selling them the comforting illusion that the brilliant risk strategist at Meridian was privately overseeing the financial architecture of this incredibly high-risk hospitality gamble. Tessa let out a low, sharp whistle. He weaponized your entire resume. I felt a cold, metallic taste flood the back of my mouth. He used me as collateral. Celeste Wynn might be the aesthetic hook for this new project, but I am the foundational financial safety net. He absolutely needed my name on the roster to legitimize the massive debt. Not anymore, Tessa said, her eyes flashing with a cold, tactical brilliance. We are dropping a bomb on his supply lines. She turned swiftly to her senior paralegal, who had just stepped into the room. Draft a formal letter of dispute regarding the digital signature on the home equity line of credit. Send it directly to the senior fraud investigator at the lending institution. We do not just freeze the account. We trigger a formal internal investigation. We notify them that the underlying encumbrance is heavily contested and demand an immediate lockdown on all withdrawals. By the time he tries to buy a cup of coffee this afternoon, his corporate credit will be completely paralyzed. While Tessa marshaled the legal artillery, I opened my own heavy laptop. The time for feeling betrayed had passed. It was time for infrastructure lockdown. I logged directly into the Meridian employee portal and completely rerouted my direct deposit payroll away from the joint bank account and straight into the shielded premarital account Monroe had just verified. I systematically changed the administrative passwords to my email, my corporate servers, and every single personal communication channel. I enabled biometric security on absolutely everything. I called my internal network director and had them wipe the trusted device registry on my profile, severing any backdoor access he might have retained through our home router. Then, using my newly secured funds, I navigated to an exclusive executive housing portal. I booked a sterile, highly secure serviced apartment in the financial district for the next 3 months. I paid the exorbitant lease in full, up front. I was surgically stripping away every single access point he had to my life, both digital and physical. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the entire counteroffensive was locked into place. Dean was currently waking up in his luxury hotel suite with his dream woman, entirely unaware that the foundation of his new corporate empire had just been professionally demolished. He genuinely believed he was managing a delicate, emotional separation from a rigid, predictable wife. He did not know about the single piece of thick ivory cardstock I had left resting on the kitchen island right before I walked out of the house in the pre-dawn darkness. I had not written a desperate plea. I had not demanded an explanation or expressed a single ounce of sorrow. I simply wrote one sentence, perfectly centered in black ink, right next to his polite hotel note. All future communications must be directed to my legal counsel, Tessa Baird. It was a single, clinical boundary line. With those 12 words, I had formally and permanently closed the safe harbor he had relied on for over a decade. The storm was coming, and he was entirely locked out in the cold. He must have practiced his face in the rearview mirror on the drive back to our neighborhood. I could easily picture it. Dean returning home around 10 in the morning, schooling his handsome features into a mask of solemn, gentle regret. He would have expected to find me sitting on the living room sofa, eyes red and swollen, a cold cup of coffee in my hands. He wanted a messy, emotional confrontation. He needed me to scream, to throw a vase, to demand answers, because my hysteria would perfectly justify his calm, civilized departure. Instead, he walked into a perfectly sanitized crime scene. The house was immaculate. My closets were neatly half-emptied. The only greeting he received was the heavy, suffocating silence of a woman who had already moved on to the logistics of his destruction, and the single sentence directing him to my attorney. Sitting at the glass desk of my rented apartment in the financial district, I watched his panic unfold in real time. My phone lay flat on the table, the screen lighting up with a predictable, escalating rhythm. The first message arrived at 10:45. It was an attempt at faux concern, playing the benevolent partner. "Aria, the house is empty. Where are you? Please call me. I am genuinely worried about your state of mind." I did not reply. I opened my black notebook and logged the exact time of the message. An hour later, the tone shifted. The benevolent partner dissolved into the aggrieved victim. Involving lawyers immediately is a massive overreaction to an honest conversation. I asked for one night to figure things out. You are spiraling. Still, I maintained absolute radio silence. The void I gave him was acting like a mirror, reflecting his own loss of control back at him. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the mask completely slipped. The third message was pure, unadulterated venom. You are turning a human mistake into a nuclear war. This rigid clinical behavior is exactly why I had to leave. You cannot handle real emotions. You are punishing me for finally being honest. He was desperate to provoke a reaction, to get me on the record saying something bitter or unhinged. When he realized the direct approach was failing, he immediately pivoted to a broader social campaign. Dean was a master brand architect, and his own image was his most prized client. If he could not control me, he would control the narrative surrounding me. Throughout the afternoon, notifications from our mutual acquaintances began to trickle in. Sarah, the wife of his college roommate, left a painfully delicate voicemail asking if I needed a place to stay because Dean had mentioned I was having a severe mental health crisis. David, our former neighbor, sent a text offering his sympathies for my sudden inability to accept the changing dynamics of our marriage. Dean was actively canvassing our social circle, painting a masterpiece of spin. He was casting himself as the brave, modern man who simply wanted to live his truth, while I was the brittle, joyless corporate drone who had violently overreacted to his quest for authenticity. He was isolating me, ensuring that by the time the dust settled, our friends would view his infidelity not as a betrayal, but as a tragic necessity for his spiritual survival. I did not issue public denials. I did not write lengthy social media posts defending my character. I simply documented every single call, every text, and the precise timeline of his whisper campaign. I was building a timeline of premeditated reputation management. Then, at 4:30 in the afternoon, I received a call that broke through the curated noise. It was Lena Pruitt. Lena was the operations manager at Hollow House Atelier. She was the quiet, hyper-organized engine that kept Dean's branding firm running while he schmoozed clients. We had always maintained a quiet mutual respect. "Aria," she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "I am calling from a burner phone. I cannot talk long, but you need to know what is happening behind the curtain. I am listening. Lena, Dean has a press rollout scheduled," she said, the words rushing out in a terrified breath. "He is booked as the headline guest on the City Vanguard Lifestyle podcast. The recording is next week. The approved topic is radical honesty leaving the comfort zone for authentic love." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the man. When was this interview booked? "He locked in the appearance over 2 weeks ago," Lena confirmed. "He submitted his talking points last Friday. He has been scripting this breakup for a month. He wants to use the divorce as a rebrand. He is going to market himself as a thought leader on emotional courage. Thank you. Lena, protect yourself. Delete this number." I hung up the phone. A cold clarity washed over me. The affair with Celeste Wynn was not a lapse in judgment. It was a carefully scheduled marketing event. He was planning to monetize the destruction of our marriage. But the true devastating blow did not come from his public relations strategy. It came from my own bloodline. At 7 o'clock that evening, my personal cell phone rang. It was my mother, Eleanor Marshall. When I answered, she was already weeping. "Aria, sweetheart," she sobbed, her voice trembling violently. "Dean just called me. He sounded entirely broken. He said you packed up and left him without a word. He said you are trying to destroy his business out of pure spite. Mom, breathe. I am perfectly fine. Dean is lying to you." "But what about the money?" "Aria," she cried out, panic sharpening her tone. "What happens to my money now that you are divorcing?" The temperature in my sterile apartment seemed to plummet. I sat up perfectly straight. "What money?" "Mom." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy, guilty intake of breath. "The $60,000, From my retirement fund. I wired it to him 3 months ago. My hand gripped the edge of the glass desk so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. You gave Dean $60,000. Without telling me, he said you knew all about it, she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of the confession. He swore to me that you completely approved of the loan for his new project, but that you absolutely could not have your name attached to the transfer because of Meridian's strict internal compliance regulations regarding outside investments. He said it was just a temporary bridge loan to secure a contractor. He promised to pay me back with interest by the end of the year. Arya, that is almost half of my liquid retirement savings. I stared blindly at the city lights beginning to flicker on outside my window. The final, massive piece of the puzzle slid into place with a sickening thud. Dean had not simply borrowed against our house. He had manipulated an elderly woman, weaponizing my corporate standing to rob my own mother of her security. And suddenly, the timing of the entire betrayal made perfect, terrifying sense. The anniversary dinner, the polite, theatrical exit, the immediate rush to control the social narrative. None of it was actually about Celeste Wynne or his desperate need for authentic love. Those were just convenient, glittering distractions. Dean was financially drowning. The walls of his hidden debts were rapidly closing in, and the $60,000 he stole from my mother had likely already evaporated into the black hole of his failing venture. He needed a massive, chaotic event to act as a smokescreen. He chose the night of our anniversary to drop the bomb of his infidelity because he needed me emotionally shattered and distracted. He needed a messy divorce to explain away the missing money, the impending bankruptcies, and the shattered contracts. He was trying to light the living room on fire so no one would notice he had already stolen the silver. He thought I would be too busy crying over his mistress to audit the accounts. He was wrong. The game had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about protecting my assets. It was about dismantling every single lie he had ever sold. I arranged the meeting in the private dining room of a quiet hotel downtown, far from the neighborhood where Dean was currently spinning his victim narrative. When my mother, Eleanor, and my younger brother, Luke, arrived, the atmosphere was immediately suffocating. Luke walked in with his jaw set tight, his posture radiating a defensive masculine solidarity with my husband. He had always admired Dean, to Luke. Dean was the charismatic older brother he never had, the man who knew which scotch to order and how to wear a tailored suit. Arya, this is insane, Luke began before he even pulled out his chair. He tossed his keys onto the polished mahogany table. Dean is an absolute wreck. He made a terrible, stupid mistake with this Celeste woman, yes. But marriages have rough patches. People stray. You do not just pack up your entire life and hire a shark attorney overnight because your husband had a midlife crisis. You are punishing him for being human. My mother sat beside him, twisting her wedding band around her finger, looking pale and fragile. She was waiting for me to break down, to validate the soap opera Dean had pitched to them. I did not offer them tears or an emotional defense. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of precisely organized manila folders. I am not divorcing a man who made a romantic mistake, I said, my voice as flat and level as a pane of glass. I am dismantling a financial parasite. I slid the first folder across the table toward Luke. Open it! Luke let out a heavy, exasperated sigh, but he flipped the cover open. That is the calendar export from his hidden digital workspace, I explained calmly. Look at the highlighted date. 3 weeks before our anniversary, Dean spent 2 hours consulting with a high-profile family law attorney. He was not swept away by sudden passion. He was legally preparing to discard me while ensuring his assets were shielded. Luke frowned, his eyes scanning the dates, the defensive posture faltering slightly. I slid the second folder over, right on top of the first. This is a commercial loan document. It leverages the entire paid-off equity of the home we own together. Notice the electronic signature at the bottom of page 32. It bears my name. The timestamp is from a Tuesday afternoon when I was airborne on a corporate flight to Denver, entirely without internet access. He forged my digital authorization to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars from my property. The silence in the private room grew dense. My mother stopped twisting her ring. Her eyes widened, darting between the stark black text on the paper and my completely expressionless face. "And this," I said, placing the third, heaviest folder gently in front of my mother, "is the ledger." Eleanor reached out with trembling hands. She looked down at the highlighted bank transfers. "When Dean came to you crying about temporary cash flow problems," I continued, keeping my tone gentle but absolutely relentless, "he told you I approved of the loan but had to remain invisible due to corporate compliance. That was a lie. He weaponized your respect for my career to bypass your common sense. You gave him $60,000 of the retirement money Dad left you." "He said it was to pay contractors," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking. "He said it was a bridge loan to keep his business afloat. My forensic accountant traced every single cent of your money," I told her. "It did not go to struggling contractors. It was immediately routed into a shadow holding company, and from there, it was paid out as non-refundable deposits for a massive luxury commercial lease. The project is called Blackstone House. It is a high-end event space he is trying to launch to pivot out of his current failing branding studio." Eleanor slumped back in her chair, the breath leaving her lungs in a ragged gasp. The illusion of the charming, successful son-in-law shattered completely, replaced by the terrifying reality of a man who had casually cannibalized an elderly woman's security net to fund his own ambition. The emotional betrayal of the affair meant nothing compared to the absolute devastation of trusting a predator. Luke was staring at the documents, his face flushed with a rising, violent anger. The timeline Dean had fed him was unraveling in real time. "He told me he just met this Celeste woman a month ago," Luke muttered, tracing the dates on the financial statements. "He swore on his life that she was a sudden, uncontrollable spark." "Celeste Wynne is not just a mistress," I corrected him, sliding the final piece of evidence onto the table. It was the glossy investor pitch deck my forensic accountant had uncovered. I flipped to the team introduction slide. "She is a marketing prop." Luke stared at the photograph of the woman. She was undeniably beautiful, but beneath her picture was a title director of client experience. "Dean is financially drowning," I explained, laying out the structural logic of the entire disaster. "His current studio is bleeding capital. He needs Blackstone House to launch successfully to save himself from total bankruptcy. But to attract the tier of wealthy investors he needs, he has to project an image of absolute, untouchable prestige. He cannot do that as a struggling local consultant. Celeste is highly connected in the luxury hospitality sector. He is using her face, her aesthetic, and her industry connections to legitimize the glamour of the new venue." I turned the page, showing them the slide that featured my own corporate headshot and fabricated advisory role. And he used my corporate salary, my flawless credit rating, and my professional reputation as the silent, invisible guarantee to secure the underlying debt. He took my house, my mother's savings, and my good name, and he bundled them together to build a launch pad for his new life with his new business partner. Luke dragged his hands over his face, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The brotherly solidarity he had walked in with was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, sharp understanding of a man who had been played for a fool. For the first time, he looked at me and did not see a bitter, overreacting wife. He saw the risk strategist methodically dissecting a catastrophic fraud. "The anniversary dinner," Luke said slowly, piecing it together. "He blew up your marriage on that specific night on purpose." "Yes," I confirmed. "He needed a dramatic, emotional distraction. He knew the debt was about to hit critical mass. If I was busy crying over his infidelity, I would not be looking at the bank statements. He wanted me to file a standard, emotionally charged divorce so he could quietly hide the fraudulent debt in the messy division of our marital assets." My mother began to cry silently, her tears falling onto the pristine pages of the forged loan document. She was grieving the loss of her financial safety, but more than that, she was grieving the absolute death of her trust. Watching her weep over the paper, a fundamental shift occurred inside my chest. Up until this exact second, my primary directive had been defensive. I wanted to secure my assets, ring-fence my premarital funds, and cleanly sever my liability from his sinking ship. I had wanted a surgical extraction. But Dean had not just targeted my bank account, he had targeted the people I loved. He had looked at my mother's lifetime of hard work and seen nothing but a slush fund. He had looked at my brother's loyalty and seen a useful idiot to spread his public relations narrative. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. The cold detachment of the corporate fixer melted away, leaving behind something much harder, much sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. I am not going to just walk away, I told them, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. I am not going to accept a quiet settlement to save face. We are going to take every single piece of paper on this table, and we are going to use it to collapse his entire foundation. I am going to make sure that the lie he built crushes him under its own weight. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, bypassing my newly secured personal inbox and landing directly in my corporate account. The subject line was entirely blank. The sender name read Celeste Wynn. The message contained exactly 2 sentences. I am seeing catastrophic financial inconsistencies regarding the Blackstone House launch. We need to speak in person. I agreed to meet her at 4 o'clock that afternoon at the Atrium Cafe inside the Contemporary Art Museum downtown. It was a sterile, echoing space constructed entirely of glass and white steel, offering absolute visibility and zero intimacy. I arrived early, ordering a plain black tea, and waited. She walked in precisely on time. Celeste Wynn did not look like a homewrecker from a daytime soap opera. She looked formidable. She wore a tailored ivory suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She moved with the fluid, calculated grace of a woman who spent her entire professional life convincing wealthy people to part with their capital. She sat across from me, placing a sleek leather phone case on the marble table. For a long moment, we simply observed the architecture of the other woman. I expected you to throw a drink in my face, Celeste began, her tone guarded, heavily laced with a defensive bravado. Or at least raise your voice. I evaluate risk for a living. Celeste, I replied, keeping my hands perfectly still, wrapped around my warm teacup. Screaming at you does not recover my stolen assets. You asked for this meeting because you found an anomaly in his system. Tell me what is broken. Celeste's defensive posture faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. She leaned forward slightly. Dean missed the primary deposit for the catering vendor yesterday. It was a massive sum. When I pressed him, he blamed a temporary asset freeze caused by your sudden, aggressive legal tactics. He told me you two have been operating under an open marriage framework for 3 years. He swore the marriage was entirely dead, that you lived like corporate roommates, and that this separation was a mutually agreed-upon transition. I looked at her, my expression completely flat. We slept in the same bed until the night he walked out. I cooked him a slow-braised short rib for our 12th anniversary dinner while he stood in my hallway wearing your perfume. There was no open arrangement. I watched the blood drain entirely from her perfectly contoured face. The confident business partner vanished, leaving behind a woman rapidly realizing she was standing on a trapdoor. He said you were thrilled to be free of the obligation, she whispered, her voice losing its polished edge. He said you shook hands on it. I do not deal in emotional interpretations, I said smoothly. I deal in documentation. I assume you brought something tangible, or you would not have risked contacting me. Celeste stared at me for a long, heavy second before picking up her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the screen and opened a hidden audio file. She slid the device across the cold marble table. He left me a voice memo 2 weeks ago when I asked how he was going to fund the final construction phase without triggering an audit from his existing studio. I pressed play. Dean's voice, smooth, incredibly arrogant, and terrifyingly calm, filled the space between us. Do not worry about the capital. Celeste, Aria is a perfectly predictable, stable capital source. I have successfully unlocked the equity on the primary residence. The money is already in motion. The anniversary weekend is going to be the clean break. I am going to initiate the transition then. By Monday morning, she will be entirely consumed by managing her own emotional fallout. She values her corporate discretion and her pristine professional image above absolutely everything else. She will never make a public scene or demand an audit. She will sign whatever settlement I put in front of her just to keep the humiliation out of the public record. We are completely covered for the launch. The recording ended. The silence in the atrium felt heavier than concrete. He had not just cheated on me. He had weaponized my own dignity against me. He believed my commitment to professionalism was actually a fatal weakness. He thought my silence was cowardice, a convenient rug under which he could sweep hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent debt. Celeste swiped the screen again, opening an email attachment. It was an advanced copy of the pitch deck, but this one included an appendix I had not seen before. It was an organizational chart for Blackstone House. My name was nowhere on it. But Celeste's name was listed at the very top, not as an equal equity partner, but as the Director of Brand Aesthetics. Her compensation was heavily tied to performance bonuses that did not actually exist yet. "Look at the equity distribution," Celeste said, her voice turning brittle with sudden sharp anger. "He retains 90% of the voting shares. I brought him the entire network of high net worth individuals. I secured the venue location. I introduced him to the primary investors, and he structured the operating agreement to make me an at-will employee with a fancy title." She looked up from the screen, her eyes locking onto mine. The animosity between us had entirely evaporated, replaced by the grim solidarity of two women who had been expertly conned by the exact same man. "I thought I was his equal partner," Celeste said quietly, the absolute humiliation finally breaking through her composed exterior. "I thought I was the woman who finally understood his vision. But I am not. I am just a luxury prop. I am a shiny new hood ornament he bought to distract the investors while he stripped your car for parts. He does not view people as partners," I told her, my voice dropping into a register of absolute, cold certainty. "He views them as leverage. You provided the social capital and the industry credibility. I provided the financial collateral and the baseline stability. He merged our assets to build a company he intends to own entirely by himself." Celeste picked up her phone, locking the screen with a sharp, definitive click. She sat up completely straight, the high-end brand director returning to the surface, but this time, the steel in her spine was real. "I am walking away from Blackstone House," she stated flatly. "I am pulling my network, and I am formally withdrawing my name from the prospectus. If you do that, he will immediately attempt to discredit you." I warned her. "He will tell the investors you are emotionally unstable. He will use the exact same playbook on you that he is currently using on me." "Let him try," Celeste countered, her jaw set. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek silver data drive, placing it deliberately next to my teacup. "This contains every email, every text message, and every voice memo he ever sent me regarding the funding structure, the timeline of his exit from your marriage, and his explicit intent to conceal the origin of the capital. It also includes the unredacted vendor contracts." I looked at the small silver rectangle. It was the final, devastating piece of ammunition I needed. "My attorney is going to issue a subpoena for your communication records by the end of the week," I informed her. "I will not contest it," Celeste replied immediately. "I will sign an affidavit confirming he actively lied about his marital status and the legality of his funding. I want absolute immunity from whatever fallout happens when you detonate this. You have my word." Celeste stood up, smoothing the front of her ivory blazer. She looked down at me, a complicated mixture of respect and horror in her eyes. "He really thought you would just sit quietly and absorb the damage to protect your reputation. Did he not?" "Yes," I said softly. "He did." She gave a single, curt nod, turned on her heel, and walked out of the glass atrium. I sat alone at the marble table for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. The entire architecture of Dean's betrayal was now laid bare before me. The profound cruelty of the anniversary night had never been about his uncontrollable passion for another woman. It was a calculated, tactical strike. He had intentionally engineered a moment of maximum emotional devastation, gambling that the sheer trauma of the infidelity would paralyze me long enough for his financial fraud to clear the bank. He needed my silence to keep the Blackstone House deal alive. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my silence. My silence was not submission. My silence was the sound of a system locking its doors before the purge. I did not wait for my husband to dictate the terms of our destruction. Exactly 48 hours after I walked out of our immaculate home, Tessa Baird marched into the county courthouse and officially filed the petition for the dissolution of our marriage. We struck first, and we struck with absolute, breathtaking brutality. The filing was not a standard, boilerplate petition citing irreconcilable differences. Tessa drafted a meticulously detailed 20-page document specifically citing intentional marital waste and gross financial fraud. Dean had fully planned to file on his own timeline, aiming to control the public narrative of a mutual progressive split. By filing first, and filing hard, we effectively cut off his oxygen, forcing him to instantly play defense on a battlefield he did not even know existed yet. The board was no longer his to command. I was actively setting the pieces. That exact same morning, the corporate lending division of our bank issued a formal notice of suspension. The massive home equity line of credit was officially frozen. They locked down the remaining balance and initiated a comprehensive internal audit regarding the disputed electronic signature. The fraud department demanded the physical device registry and suspended all outgoing wire capabilities. To ensure the bank had absolutely no room to maneuver, my security team at Meridian Civic Systems provided a notarized affidavit. The chief information officer personally pulled my corporate access logs, geo-tracking data, and flight manifests. The documentation conclusively proved that at the exact minute the loan document was digitally signed from our home Internet Protocol address. I was seated on a corporate jet, entirely disconnected from the grid. It was an ironclad alibi that shifted Dean's actions from a messy marital dispute directly into the realm of federal wire fraud. Back in the war room of Tessa's law firm, Monroe Keats finalized the master financial timeline. He printed it on a massive architectural plotter and pinned it to the corkboard. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of forensic architecture. A single bow, heavy red line connected the initial loan origination, the exact date my mother wired the $60,000. The rapid succession of wire transfers feeding into the Blue Aster Ventures shell company, the aggressive email campaigns soliciting venture capital, and finally, the meticulously chosen date of our anniversary dinner. The board proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that his sudden infidelity was merely the theatrical capstone to an 8-month embezzlement scheme. The affair was just the smoke. This board was the fire. We did not stop at the legal filings and the bank freezes. We aimed straight for the jugular of his new enterprise. Tessa drafted a blistering cease and desist letter, legally known as a notice of dispute. We sent it via certified overnight courier directly to the primary venture capital firm backing Blackstone House. The language was absolutely unequivocal. It explicitly stated that I had never served as a strategic advisor, that I had never pledged a single cent of my personal or marital assets to guarantee their investment, and that the foundational capital structure of the entire project was currently the subject of an active, escalating fraud investigation. Meanwhile, my inside intelligence continued to flow. Lena Pruitt, operating entirely from her untraceable burner phone, forwarded a critical cache of internal studio emails. Dean had mapped out a comprehensive media strategy with a boutique public relations firm. His plan was to officially announce our civilized, amicable separation exactly 3 days after the Blackstone House grand opening gala. He intended to use the momentum of the successful launch to bury the asset division, framing his new, massive wealth as entirely post-separation income, neatly excluding me from the corporate valuation. The emails proved premeditation on a level that made Tessa actually smile, a cold, predatory curving of her lips. I still needed the physical evidence Dean had left behind at the house, but my presence there would trigger a confrontation, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing my face. Luke volunteered. My brother had completely shed his previous loyalty to Dean. The revelation regarding the theft of our mother's retirement funds had activated a quiet, relentless rage in him, under the guise of picking up some winter coats I had left behind. Luke spent 3 hours meticulously sweeping the property while Dean was at his studio desperately trying to manage the collapsing investor relations. Luke bypassed the home security cameras, accessed Dean's home office, and loaded a heavy canvas duffel bag. He grabbed old physical hard drives, original tax returns from the fireproof safe, misplaced vendor contracts, and a massive stack of unsorted mail Dean had neglected in his mounting panic. Luke delivered the heavy bag to my serviced apartment late that evening. He dropped it onto the floor with a heavy thud, his jaw tight, his loyalty permanently, aggressively realigned. And then, the isolation began to truly crush my husband. Stripped of his narrative control, frozen out of his credit lines, and likely facing extremely hostile questions from his lead investors, his polished, gentlemanly facade violently shattered. He began calling my new, secure mobile number incessantly. I never answered the phone, but I let every single call go directly to voicemail. The recordings became a real-time psychological study of an arrogant man in absolute freefall. In the morning, his voice would be low, dripping with a practiced, seductive melancholy. He would reminisce about our first trip to Paris, begging me to remember the soft, forgiving woman I used to be before the lawyers poisoned my mind against him. He tried to play the role of the misunderstood lover, hoping nostalgia would crack my resolve. By early afternoon, when the bank likely rejected another one of his checks, the tone would drastically pivot to frantic, breathless apologies. He claimed he was merely overwhelmed by the terrifying pressure of launching the new business, that he had entirely lost his way, and that he would return every single dollar if I just paused the legal filings for 1 week. When I remained perfectly silent, the evening voicemails turned vicious. He screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with genuine rage. He blamed me for his impending financial ruin, accusing me of maliciously destroying a brilliant, visionary man out of sheer, petty jealousy over Celeste Wynne. He called me a sterile, vindictive machine. And finally, late at night, fueled by whatever he was drinking to cope with the collapse of his empire, the raw threats arrived. He promised to drag my name through the mud in the local press, to expose my corporate secrets, and to make sure I lost my executive position at Meridian Civic Systems. He thought his escalating rage would intimidate me into submission. He thought he was exerting power. He did not realize that I was simply sitting at my glass desk, downloading every single audio file, perfectly transcribing the threats, and handing them directly to Tessa. With every unhinged voicemail, every dramatic, flailing shift from seduction to fury, Dean was meticulously building the exact behavioral profile of an unstable, manipulative liability. He was literally doing my attorney's job for her, handing us the nails for his own coffin, one frantic recording at a time. All I had to do was listen, record, and let him bleed out into the silence. It was exactly 72 hours before his grand investor launch when the building concierge called my secure line. "Mr. Holloway was in the lobby. I did not invite him up to my sanctuary." I took the elevator down to the glass-walled foyer, my posture rigid, my expression wiped completely clean. Dean was standing by the polished marble security desk holding a massive, expensive arrangement of white orchids. He had meticulously styled himself to look aesthetically devastated. His tailored suit jacket was missing, his collar was undone, his eyes were bloodshot, and his shoulders slumped with exactly the right amount of tragic, cinematic remorse. Above his head, the blinking red light of the building's high-definition security camera captured every single frame of his performance. "Arya, please," he said, stepping forward as I approached, his voice thick with carefully modulated emotion. "Just give me 5 minutes. That is all I am asking." I stopped a deliberate distance away, keeping my hands resting loosely at my sides. "Speak." He launched into a perfectly rehearsed, agonizing monologue. He claimed he was suffering from profound, blinding burnout. He attempted to pivot the entire weight of his guilt onto Celeste Wynne, painting himself as a passive victim of her seduction. "She preyed on my exhaustion," he whispered, his eyes searching mine for any trace of the woman who used to soothe his anxieties. I was drowning in the pressure of providing for our lifestyle, and she offered a temporary fantasy where I was simply admired. It meant absolutely nothing to me. I was just lost. Then came the actual pivot, the true reason he had bought the orchids and tracked me down. "I know you are angry," he continued, taking a slow step closer, lowering his voice into a desperate, intimate register. "But please, you have to pause the legal filings. Just give me until next week, after the Blackstone House Investor Gala. If you blow this project up now, we both lose everything. I can fix this. I can make us whole again. But you have to stop the lawyers from destroying my life's work before it even begins." I looked at the delicate white petals of the orchids, then back at his perfectly constructed mask of sorrow. I did not feel a single flicker of the old, familiar warmth. I felt nothing but the cold hum of a machine analyzing a faulty input. All settlement offers, timeline requests, and negotiations must be routed directly through my legal counsel. "Tessa Baird," I said, my voice carrying clearly and flatly across the quiet lobby, ensuring the concierge heard every syllable. "Do not come to my residence again." I turned my back on him without waiting for a reply. As the heavy metal doors of the elevator slid shut, I caught his reflection in the polished steel. The grieving, desperate husband vanished instantly. His features hardened into a mask of pure, terrified realization. He finally understood that I was no longer a woman he could manipulate with shared memories and hollow apologies. The emotional levers he used to pull were entirely disconnected. By the time I reached my floor, my phone was vibrating on the glass desk. Dean had immediately initiated phase 2 of his containment strategy. He had sent a mass electronic mail to our entire extended family, our mutual friends, and even selected neighbors. The subject line read, "Seeking grace in a season of darkness." In 3 beautifully drafted, heavily sanitized paragraphs, he admitted to a profound but temporary moral failing. He begged for their collective prayers, stating he was completely committed to saving his marriage, but that his wife was currently making rash, destructive decisions out of understandable, blinding pain. He was trying to weave a massive net of peer pressure, weaponizing the empathy of our social circle to guilt me into dropping the financial assault. He wanted them to view my legal boundaries as an act of cruel hysteria. I proactively countered his narrative within the hour. I organized a highly controlled meeting with my mother, Eleanor, and my brother, Luke, in my apartment. Dean thought his poetic email would soften their resolve. Instead, I laid Monroe Keats's finalized financial timeline flat across my dining table. We did not rehash the emotional betrayal. We reviewed the raw, undeniable architecture of his fraud. I walked Eleanor and Luke through every single date, matching Dean's timeline of his so-called temporary failing against the cold, hard banking records of his long-term embezzlement. I showed them how the mass email was not an apology, but a calculated public relations maneuver designed to shield his assets. By the end of the evening, my mother's residual grief had burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute anger. Luke sat beside her, helping me draft a short, unified family response instructing everyone in our network to respect my privacy and completely ignore Dean's manipulative outreach. The family shield was locked firmly into place. The pressure cooker was reaching its absolute structural limit. Exactly 2 days before the launch, Lena Pruitt sent a massive encrypted file from her burner device. It was the final, printer-ready version of the Blackstone House investor dossier. Despite the formal cease and desist letter, despite the frozen bank accounts, and despite Celeste Wynne walking away, Dean had not altered a single word of the financial prospectus. My photograph was still sitting prominently on page 12. My corporate executive salary was still explicitly listed under the heading of secured spousal financial backing. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it made my pulse hammer in my throat. He was going to stand in a room full of millionaires and blatantly lie to their faces, betting his entire existence on the assumption that I would never cause a public scene to stop him. He believed my desire for peace would always override my desire for justice. I forwarded the dossier directly to Tessa. Her response was swift, lethal, and entirely devoid of mercy. She immediately filed an emergency addendum to our divorce petition. She legally categorized the $60,000 Dean had taken from my mother not as a separate, messy familial dispute, but as a deliberate, actionable dissipation of marital assets. Tessa demanded that Eleanor be fully reimbursed directly off the top of Dean's portion of the property division. We transformed a private family betrayal into a binding, unavoidable legal liability. There would be no quiet, off-the-books repayment plan. The theft was now permanently etched into the public, financial record of our dissolution. He could not ignore it, and he could not erase it. As I sat at my desk reviewing the final pages of Lena's leaked dossier, my eyes caught the logistical details for the grand investor gala. Blackstone House itself was still an active, dusty construction site, completely unfit for a luxury presentation. Therefore, Dean had secured a prestigious off-site venue for the high-stakes launch. I stared at the bold, elegant font, indicating the location, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. The Grand Bohemian Hotel. It was the exact same hotel where he had booked a luxury suite with Celeste Wynne on the night of our 12th anniversary. He was returning to the exact scene of his infidelity to crown himself a visionary entrepreneur. It was a choice of profound, almost psychopathic theatrical cruelty. He loved the dramatic irony of it. He was displaying his absolute addiction to transforming the devastation of other people into his own personal, glittering stage. He truly believed he was the untouchable director of this play, maneuvering all the actors exactly where he wanted them. He had absolutely no idea that the theater he was about to step into was already wired with explosives, and I was sitting quietly in the dark, holding the detonator. The official settlement proposal arrived via secure courier exactly 48 hours before the scheduled launch at the Grand Bohemian Hotel. It was bound in heavy navy cardstock, looking significantly more like a luxury real estate brochure than a formal legal surrender. Tessa dropped it onto my glass desk with a sound of profound professional disgust. Dean was formally requesting a closed-door, highly confidential mediation. In exchange for a perfectly equal, 50-50 split of all remaining liquid assets, he demanded I immediately withdraw the allegations of financial fraud and marital waste from the public divorce petition. He was banking heavily on the fundamental core of my personality. He had spent 12 years watching me meticulously manage corporate crises by quietly burying liabilities to protect the overarching brand. He was absolutely certain I would prioritize my pristine professional reputation over a messy, highly publicized courtroom victory. He genuinely thought I would pay him to go away quietly. But the true audacity of the document was buried deep in Section 4. Under a clause cleverly titled Joint Venture Reconciliation, Dean was attempting to categorically shift a massive portion of the Blue Aster Ventures debt into a shared marital business opportunity. He argued that because the initial capital was sourced from our primary residence, any subsequent liabilities incurred by the holding company were our collective, unavoidable burden. He was trying to handcuff me to the steering wheel of a car he had already driven off a cliff. While I was reading the poisonous settlement, Monroe Keats walked into the room. He did not sit down. He simply slid a single, red-flagged banking summary across the glass, placing it right over Dean's signature line. "I just pulled the most recent shadow ledger from the primary lender," Monroe said, his voice stripped of its usual dry, mechanical sarcasm. "Look closely at the arrears." I scanned the document. My eyes immediately locked onto a column of bright red text. Dean had not just drained the home equity line of credit to the absolute maximum limit. He had missed the minimum monthly servicing payments for the past 2 consecutive cycles. He was officially 60 days past due. The entire financial structure was not merely unstable, it was actively, violently collapsing. In exactly 14 days, the bank was scheduled to initiate formal foreclosure proceedings on our home. The air left my lungs in a sharp, cold rush. If I had stayed in that house, if I had spent the last 2 weeks weeping over a marriage counselor's sofa, instead of instantly freezing the accounts and filing the fraud disputes, the catastrophic default would have dragged me down with him. My flawless credit rating, my executive clearance at Meridian Civic Systems, and my personal financial autonomy would have been entirely annihilated by the end of the month. Suddenly, the entire landscape of the betrayal shifted, snapping into a horrifying new focus. The core motive behind the anniversary dinner completely changed colors. Dean did not walk out that night because he was overwhelmed by an uncontrollable, burning passion for Celeste Wynne. He did not choose the milestone of our 12th year together because he wanted to be brutally honest with himself. He chose that specific night because he knew the foreclosure notices were already in the mail. He knew the absolute destruction of our financial life was imminent. He needed a devastating emotional narrative to serve as a massive smokescreen for his criminal negligence. By abandoning me for his dream woman, he was proactively setting the stage to blame the impending bankruptcy on the messy, chaotic fallout of a broken heart. He wanted our friends, the investors, and the courts to believe his business failed because his marriage collapsed, not because he was a reckless, incompetent thief. He was entirely willing to destroy my reality just to manage his public relations timeline. I pushed the settlement offer away from me. Tell his lawyer we reject the terms entirely. There will be absolutely no mediation. There will be no confidentiality agreements. Tessa smiled, a feral, terrifying expression. I was hoping you would say that. Because we have another piece of heavy artillery. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a freshly notarized affidavit. Celeste had kept her word. The document was a masterclass in self-preservation. Under penalty of perjury, Celeste formally testified that Dean Holloway had explicitly lied to her regarding his marital status, claiming he was legally separated. More importantly, she confirmed he had repeatedly assured her the seed capital for Blackstone House was entirely clean and completely free of spousal encumbrance. Attached to the back of the affidavit was her formal resignation as Director of Brand Aesthetics, effective immediately. I forwarded a copy of this sworn statement to the lead venture capital firm exactly 1 hour ago. Tessa informed me. The impact of that email was instantaneous. By noon, my internal network sources confirmed that the primary investor had officially contacted Dean's studio. They formally announced they were halting all capital injections and initiating an emergency review of their participation in the project. The very foundation of Blackstone House was crumbling beneath his incredibly expensive shoes. Yet, the launch event was not canceled. Lena Pruitt sent a quick, frantic message from her burner device late that afternoon. Dean was doubling down. He was entirely fueled by the desperate, manic delusion that his charisma could override cold, hard accounting. He genuinely believed that if he could just get the wealthy investors into the ballroom of the Grand Bohemian Hotel, if he could just pour enough expensive champagne and deliver a passionate, visionary speech, he could hypnotize them into ignoring the legal warnings. He thought he could outrun the truth if he just spoke eloquently enough and fast enough. He was banking his entire future on the assumption that I would remain invisible. He assumed the Director of Risk Strategy would stay safely hidden behind her attorney's desk, letting the paperwork slowly fight the battle in civil court over the next 2 years. He thought the absolute silence I had maintained since the night he left was a white flag of surrender. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. Looking out over the sprawling corporate skyline of the city, I thought about my mother, weeping over her stolen retirement fund. I thought about the forged digital signature on the 32-page loan document. I thought about the sheer, suffocating arrogance of a man who believed he could burn down my entire life and seamlessly use the ashes to build a glittering monument to himself. Draft the final asset preservation orders, Tessa, I said, my voice resonating with a metallic, absolute finality. Have the courier ready to deliver the bank's formal fraud investigation mandate directly to the venue. I was not going to let him control the timeline for one more second. I was not going to settle for a quiet, heavily redacted victory in a closed courtroom several months from now. I wanted the consequences to arrive at the exact moment he expected his coronation. I chose to let the brutal truth detonate right in the middle of his carefully constructed stage, on the very morning he intended to step into the spotlight as a self-made winner. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of the Blackstone House launch, the final trap was sprung. There was no hesitation, no opportunity for negotiation, and absolutely no warning. Tessa Baird marched into the courthouse and filed the devastating supplementary motion to our divorce petition. The document meticulously detailed the comprehensive financial fraud, formally requesting absolute protection over all disputed assets and legally demanding the immediate dollar-for-dollar restitution of the money stolen from my mother. Simultaneously, the corporate fraud division of our lending institution executed their mandate. They transmitted a formal binding notice of suspension directly to Dean's primary business inbox and his studio manager. The notice explicitly stated that the effective collateral of our home equity was entirely suspended pending an active federal review of the forged electronic signature. The bedrock of his entire venture capital pitch was instantly pulverized, but the most lethal strike was delivered by courier. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, every single primary investor, strategic partner, and key advisor involved with Blackstone House received a thick, certified legal dossier from Tessa's office. The cover letter was brief and terrifying. It formally notified them that I, Aria Marshall, had never consented to act as a financial guarantor, had never contributed a single cent of capital to Blue Aster Ventures, and was currently engaging in aggressive litigation regarding the legality of the entire corporate structure they were about to fund. I envisioned Dean walking into the opulent ballroom of the Grand Bohemian Hotel at 9 o'clock. He would have been dressed impeccably, armed with his most charming smile, ready to change his life forever. But the reality he stepped into was a sudden, suffocating nightmare. Celeste Wynne was noticeably absent. Instead of a room buzzing with excited anticipation, he found a tense, deeply uncomfortable silence. The key venture capitalists were huddled in tight clusters, their eyes locked onto the glowing screens of their smartphones, reading the legal warnings. The polite smiles directed at him were rigid, laced with sudden, acute suspicion. I arrived at the venue at 10 o'clock. I did not march into the main ballroom to create a public spectacle or hurl accusations across the catered breakfast buffet. I walked quietly through the side entrance, flanked securely by Tessa and Monroe Keats. The lead representative for the primary venture capital firm had already demanded an emergency clarification meeting. We bypassed the gala entirely and stepped directly into the private executive boardroom adjacent to the main hall. Dean was already sitting at the heavy mahogany table, looking completely cornered, desperately trying to convince the two senior investors that the legal letters were merely the hysterical fabrications of a bitter soon-to-be ex-wife. When I walked through the heavy oak doors, the remaining color drained entirely from my husband's face. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. I did not look at him. I took the seat at the opposite end of the long table. Tessa placed her briefcase on the polished wood, and Monroe immediately connected his laptop to the room's presentation monitor. The investors watched us with cold, clinical calculation. They did not care about broken vows. They cared about liability. "Gentlemen," Tessa began, her voice slicing through the heavy tension like a scalpel. "My client is here to provide the verification you requested regarding the legal standing of the collateral underwriting this project." Monroe did not waste a single breath on introductions. He pressed a button, and the screen illuminated with the undeniable chronological architecture of Dean's financial deception. He presented the massive commercial loan document, zooming in on the fraudulent digital signature. He displayed my flight manifest and the geo-tracking data proving I was 30,000 feet in the air without internet access at the exact moment the authorization was stamped. Dean attempted to interject, his voice high and frantic, claiming it was a simple administrative misunderstanding. The senior investor held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. His eyes locked on Monroe's screen. Monroe ruthlessly moved forward. He projected the shadow ledger showing the 2 consecutive missed payments on the primary loan. He displayed the unauthorized use of my corporate headshot and executive salary in the initial pitch decks. He laid bare the undeniable reality that the entire project was built on stolen equity and was currently 60 days away from catastrophic foreclosure. It took exactly 14 minutes to dismantle a lie that took him almost a year to build. The senior investor closed his leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. He looked at Dean, not with anger, but with the profound, chilling disgust reserved for a terrible investment. "We are officially withdrawing our participation in Blue Aster Ventures," the investor stated flatly. "Do not contact our firm again." The other strategic partner stood up without a word, followed the lead investor out the door, and the entire Blackstone House launch collapsed right there on the boardroom table. The silence they left behind was absolute. In the long, grueling months of legal resolution that followed, the architecture we had built held perfectly. Because we had struck first and secured the forensic evidence immediately, the judge granted every single one of our financial motions. I retained absolute control of my separate, premarital assets. I was completely shielded from the massive liabilities and toxic debt of Blue Aster Ventures, which was forced into immediate bankruptcy. The money Dean had extracted from my mother was legally classified as marital waste and was forcefully deducted straight from his meager share of the liquidated joint properties before he saw a single dime. On the final day of the mediation, after the last binding document was signed, we stood in the empty hallway of the courthouse. Dean looked entirely hollowed out. Stripped of his studio, his investors, his dream woman, and his unearned prestige, he was just a deeply indebted man facing a very bleak, very ordinary reality. For the first time in our 12 years together, he possessed absolutely no words to spin the narrative. He stared at me, shaking his head slowly in a daze. "I just never believed you would actually go this far," he whispered, his voice barely echoing in the marble corridor. "You destroyed everything." I looked at the man I used to cook for, the man I used to build firewalls to protect. I felt no lingering sadness, no residual rage, just the clean, satisfying hum of a perfectly executed risk mitigation protocol. "I did not destroy anything," I replied, my voice cold, sharp, and entirely free of him. "I just turned on the lights." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, I sat in the bright, sunlit office of my real estate attorney. I uncapped my favorite pen and signed my name to the final closing documents for a beautiful, secure townhouse located right in the heart of the city. The deed was entirely in my name. I placed the pen down and glanced at the date printed at the top of the crisp white page. It was the exact calendar date of my former wedding anniversary. I smiled, feeling the quiet, immense power of reclaiming my own timeline. I had successfully transformed the day I was betrayed into the exact day I officially ceased being the safety net for anyone but myself. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by more people.